with old romance, away with novels, plots, and plays of foreign courts, away with love verses sugared in rhyme. I raise a voice for far superber themes, for poets and for art, to exalt the present and the real, to teach the average man the glory of his daily walk and trade.
Thus spoke Walt Whitman, a poet of America, a man who broke with tradition, who found new themes for poetry and developed new styles. Walt Whitman was born in a farmhouse on Long Island, New York in 1819, a time when America was primarily a farming nation. As a young man, he taught school and worked on newspapers in the country. In many poems, he recalled rural sights and sounds. Looking back to his boyhood, he wrote,
"There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became, and that object became part of him for the day, or a certain part of the day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years." The early lilacs became part of this child, and grass, and white and red morning glories, and white and red clover, and the song of the phoebe bird, and the third month lambs.
In New York City, between 1839 and 1848, he worked on newspapers. So he took part in one of the great changes of the period, the shift of many Americans from village and farm to the cities, and the city became part of him. He was a fashionable dandy. City life was his life, and New York his city.
Vehicles, Broadway, the women, the shops and shows, a million people, manners free and superb, open voices, hospitality. City of hurried and sparkling waters, city of spires and masts, city nestled in bays, my city.
Whitman knew the movement of Americans from country to city because he took part in it. He also knew at first hand the westward movement of pioneers surging across the continent, shaping the course of American history.
Pioneers, oh pioneers, all the past we leave behind. We debouch upon a newer, mightier world, varied world. Fresh and strong the world we seize, world of labor and the march. Pioneers, oh pioneers.
In 1848, Whitman left New York and journeyed southward and westward to New Orleans, Louisiana. Along the way, he saw a part of America's frontier. He saw firsthand pioneers who were hewing civilization out of wilderness. He saw men and women who were braving the unknown to establish new homes. He saw some of the vast, rich land of America as he followed the rivers down to New Orleans. In New Orleans, he encountered a new way of life, new peoples, a new culture. After a stay of a few months, he returned to New York by way of Chicago and the Great Lakes. This trip acquainted him with other parts of the growing country. Back in the East again, in the late 1840s and early 1850s, Whitman was writing for a newspaper and a magazine and working as a carpenter with his father. Now his viewpoint was changing. He could speak of farm life, for he had lived it as a child. He could speak of city life, for he was part of it. He could speak of pioneer life, for he had seen it. He had seen the major elements of American life. So a change was coming over Whitman. Walter Whitman, the fashionable dandy, was changing to Walt Whitman, the man who considered himself a spokesman for the real, everyday people of a changing America. So Whitman, a typesetter by trade, printed by hand one of the most remarkable books in the history of our literature. The poems it contained were as unusual as its publication. He called it Leaves of Grass. When Leaves of Grass reached the hands of the critics, it was read with surprise and disgust. By the standards of the day, they were not poems at all.
In all people I see myself, none more and not one a barleycorn less. And the good or bad I say of myself, I say of them.
The lines did not rhyme, nor did they carry the regular rhythms that marked the poetry of that day. No, Leaves of Grass was written in a new style. Later scholars have said that Whitman's style came in part from the echoing phraseology of the Old Testament, familiar to Whitman from his boyhood. In part from the great flowing oratory of Whitman's day, and in part from Whitman's reaction to the things about which he wrote. His was poetry of the common man, using everyday rough language. But common men did not read it, and Whitman the poet began a struggle for recognition that he continued for almost 50 years. He published new editions of Leaves of Grass, one in 1856, another in 1860. New poems were added. Then in 1861, the Civil War tore asunder the United States. And its events, suffering, and great personalities left their effects upon Whitman and his writings.
Beat, beat, drums. Blow, bugles, blow. Through the windows, through the doors, burst like a ruthless force.
During most of the war, Whitman was in Washington, helping to care for the wounded and the sick. His sympathy for his fellow men deepened, and his ideas turned more from man to humanity. During the war years, some of the forcefulness of his early poems gave way to thoughtfulness and human understanding. When Lincoln was assassinated, Whitman wrote,
Hushed be the camps today, and soldiers, let us drape our war-worn weapons.
Years that had changed America had turned Whitman from one of the roughs to a more thoughtful, more serene man, the good gray poet as he became known. This new mood and spirit reflected his reaction to the war and to the movements of the post-Civil War world. North and South were joined again in peace. And East and West were also joined by the great industry of the railroad builders. Across the Atlantic was stretched a cable to carry messages from continent to continent, while America and Europe were tied more closely to the Far East by the Suez Canal. In all this, Whitman saw a great design.
In the old world, the East, the Suez Canal. The new by its mighty railroad spanned. The seas inlaid with eloquent, gentle wires. Lo, soul, seest thou not God's purpose from the first? The earth to be spanned, connected by network.
Whitman admired the products of science and invention. Of the locomotive, he wrote,
thy black cylindric body, golden brass and silvery steel, thy ponderous sidebars, parallel and connecting rods.
So year after year, edition after edition, this remarkable book was changed and enlarged. New works were published, then incorporated in Leaves of Grass, as Whitman's appreciation of America and the world grew and deepened. And during these years, America and the world came to appreciate Whitman. His style was imitated by poets in America and in Europe. Yet it did not bring Whitman financial success. The last years of his life he spent here in Camden, New Jersey, until his death in 1892. This is one of the last pictures of Walt Whitman, a truly remarkable man, and one of the great American poets. His use of free verse helped to establish this style of poetry.
There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became.
He wrote of the westward movement, and some of his works developed this American theme. He chose subjects for his poems with freedom and rebelliousness of spirit, as did the writers of realism, and he was considered a realist by many of them. As the fame of Whitman's writing spread throughout our country and the world, poetry of and for the common man, by a most uncommon man, became a part of American literature.